utters the very first commandment. And he sets all kinds of parameters here. He says to Moses, Moses, you can come up on the mountain, and I will meet with you there, and I will speak to you, and I will give you the law of my covenant. And after 3 days of consecration and purification, the trumpet will sound, and all of the people of Israel will gather at the base of the mountain. But make it plain to them that not one of them is allowed to set foot on this mountain or even to touch it. Because if anyone touches this holy mountain, that person shall be executed, either by stoning or by being shot with an arrow. And even if their dogs or their livestock approach and bump up against the side of the mountain, they shall be summarily executed, because this is a holy moment. Do you see? The entire drama of the Old Testament has to do with the meeting over and over again of a God who is holy and of people who are not. And from the fall in paradise, from the time God sent the angel with the flaming sword as a sentinel guarding the entry to Eden, we have been held at a distance from the immediate presence of God. And so that motif is contained here with the giving of the law. And then we read this record. Then it came to pass on the third day, verse 16 of chapter 19, in the morning, that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all of the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Listen to the visual, graphic images that are used to describe this event. In the morning of the occasion, there is this thick cloud, this dense fog that is covering the entire pinnacle of Sinai, so that the people can see nothing but this vapor, this mist, and an occasional flash of lightning and the booming and roaring of thunder. And so with the fog, the thunder, and the lightning, the people who approach the base of this mountain, the people who approach the base of the mountain are trembling. I don't want us to miss that, because religion in our day is casual. It's cavalier. We think nothing of approaching the presence of God in the most cavalier way possible. We speak of God as if He were a peer, a buddy that we can hang out with. Somehow in the church we have lost our sense of reverence, our sense of awe before the living God. People, pay attention to these moments of encounter in Old Testament history, because the God who manifests Himself here at Mount Sinai has not changed His nature one bit since that day. And it is still appropriate, even for those who are clothed with the righteousness of Christ, even for those who are invited to come boldly into the heavenly place, even for those who experience redemption, to still have a sense of trembling before God. We know the great black spiritual, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" And the refrain that we hear again and again, sometimes it causes me to tremble. And then God comes down, and He comes down in His normal theophany. A theophany is the outward manifestation the visible manifestation of the invisible God. And the one manner of theophany that is used more often than any other in Scripture is the manifestation of some kind of fire. Even as God had appeared to Moses initially in the burning bush, the bush that was not consumed, so now he descends as fire. And the cloud becomes not a cloud of mist and fog, but a deep, dense cloud of smoke from the presence of God. Sinai was completely in smoke. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain. And Moses went up. And the Lord spoke to Moses, and he said, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. And let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." Isn't that an interesting phrase? Lest the Lord break out. We talk about a breakout of war, take a breakout or an epidemic of some infectious disease. But here the Bible speaks of the outbreaking of the Lord. If God breaks out, the people perish. So Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it.'" And it's in this context that we read in verse 25 of chapter 19. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Again, before the first commandment is uttered, the people were reminded of who it was whose law was being given. "I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I am the one who brought you out of bondage." And then he gives the 10 words, the Decalogue, that he writes with his own finger on tablets of stone. But I want us to understand that though much of the content of the 10 Commandments deals with how we are to relate with each other as human beings in a human community, we're not to steal, we're not to covet, we're not to bear false witness, we're not to kill, we're not to commit adultery, and so on, that at the beginning of the law, the focus of the divine mandate is on worship and how people are to relate to him. No other gods before you. No making of graven images. Not taking his name in vain. Remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now we also have a tendency to think that that's the whole law. And instead, the 10 Commandments are only the foundational law for the whole, what's called the Book of the Covenant, or the Holiness Code of ancient Israel. For chapter after chapter, after Exodus 20, we get a list of further principles of legislation. And the difference is found chiefly in the literary form in which they come to us. The 10 Commandments are expressed in terms of what's called apodictic law. An apodictic law is that law that is communicated in the literary form of personal address. Thou shalt, or thou shalt not. These are the absolute categories that God requires in terms of obedience from his people. Then what follows the apodictic law is what's called the casuistic law, or the case law of Israel. And it is expressed in the literary formula of the conditional statement, or what's called the if-then. If your ox gores your neighbor's donkey, then such and such penalties have to be paid. That is, the case law are examples of particular applications of the universal law of the Decalogue, showing that the law of God applies concretely to every conceivable human situation. And so not only do you get the moral absolutes in the Decalogue, but then you get a list of specific examples of how that absolute law is to be followed through in the lives of the people. So the laws that follow in Israel are laws that determine the ceremonies, the civil legislation, medical, diagnostic principles, but most importantly, as we see in the Old Testament, and we saw at Sinai itself, that the law of God is given to teach us how to worship Him.